grisly trail of murders which included the death of the actress Sharon Tate.
Sometimes life is just not fair for some and can take a turn into a situation that still many years into the future seems messier than simple. But as fate would have it, a guy who had a hard upbringing finds himself in California preaching a message that he was passionate about. But something took a turn that led him into a historical cult leader that changed the world just in a minute. Charles Manson is still one of those people whose life is being dissected still today, and people just want to know more about. From Charlie inspiring the young and unloved, to old and evil, still inspiring those who listen. What led to the killings on top of the hill in 1969? Maybe Charles was just an experiment himself, cult leader, an instrument for the CIA, just a musician, or just a madman that had many disciples that obeyed his every command. This is Charles Manson, the preacher from the underworld.
The same jury is to decide the punishment for Manson and the others, either life in prison or death in the gas chamber.
When we find Charlie, it's 1967. Charlie is living in California, where he is starting the footprints of his cult, finding the lost and the hurt, preaching his gospel. Charlie is preaching that he's going to be the new savior. He's still not known to the world, but his small group of followers is multiplying. In 67, history takes a turn, where people are calling their summer the summer of love. This fits right into Charlie's narrative, living free, not obeying what society wants, finding runaways, finding the hurt and loss, embracing them with his message, also entertaining them with elements he has at his fingertips: shelter, drugs, food, women. 67, Charlie is doing something unique for that time, something that's first recorded really. He's starting a cult, but not just any cult. When Charlie was out running errands, or even stealing stuff around town, he would have his main girls around him. They would not speak unless told to. They would do as they're told and obey Charlie. This is the beginning of the Manson family. In 1952, a very important part of the story would start that would involve Charlie later on. The CIA named group MKUltra would be born. This is where the story takes a dramatic turn. With the culture of the hippie movement in the 1960s, it's now speculated, and fragments of it have been proven, that the group MKUltra infiltrated the community, looking for somebody that people looked to, someone that already had footprints in the community, and that's where Charlie comes into the picture with MKUltra. It's known that MKUltra would experiment on prisoners with different drugs, LSD being one of the main ones. Prisoners would be given heavy doses to essentially they would become a person that would obey commands no matter what they were told. Another strong element that was involved with MKUltra was hypnosis, making the person believe things about who they were, what they could be, or what somebody else was to them. It's said that Charlie has direct involvement with the CIA when it comes to this very involvement with using LSD and hypnosis on people. LSD at that time is still very new to the world. It's not known. It's being used as a weapon almost, a tool. Charlie is giving LSD to his followers and people that he wants something from. He is also, from what it said, Charlie is practicing hypnosis himself on people. What we are seeing with Charlie and the females and the men is that Charlie is grooming them. He is becoming something more than human to them. This is something that cult leaders do, gaining people's trust. They make people think that they need them, and it boils down to one thing. It's fear. It's fear that the person will have towards their leader, of missing out, not being loved, wanting to be the best for them, no matter what that person has to do for the leader. Charlie is becoming a god in his own tribe. Inside the cult, many stories would come out years later about what Charlie was doing before the Manson family was even known about. As Charlie is starting his cult, he will start having multiple women to himself that he would call his wives, and even to this day, it's known that many women would become pregnant and give birth. There's still people breaking their silence and saying they are children of Charlie Manson. Charlie was even prostituting the women out for money or just supplies. They would do whatever he said to do. It's slowly building up to the most extreme orders you can give a person. We see Charlie using the most loyal as one of his strongest elements he has, sending them out to look for followers. They're recruiting people, offering drugs, prostitution, whatever the person seems to be looking for. They confuse the young and lost and unloved, and give them sympathy, love, and courage where they seem to need it. Charlie's followers will simply start talking about their theology, changing the mind of whoever they're talking to. Changing the theology of a person's life can start with just the smallest seed. With Charlie giving all these commands to his followers, they call it Charlie's bidding. The main belief that has been around for why the Manson family did what they did for years now is something that Charlie told the police and kept saying till the day he died. The main point to what Charlie was teaching when it came to his theology, telling his disciples, his family, is that there was going to be a race war. This would be Helter Skelter. Charlie says that he was listening to the White Album by the Beatles, saying that it gave him messages of what was coming, and he had been spoken to directly. Basically years into the future, after the race war was over, Charlie and his family would rise up from the desert where they were hiding. Charlie being the new savior, they would repopulate the earth. This is what Charlie would preach to his family, and what they would also preach to the lost. By 1969, Charlie has many followers, and most of them will obey and do what he says, and wanting to be the one that pleases him the most. When looking at all these kids that believed and trusted in Charlie so much, it was said that the men wanted to be him, and the women wanted to be with him. One of the ex-members would say this: "I and so many other middle-class girls were just lost, and we were just wrapped up in a world of Charlie." Leading up to the murders, it's known that they will even take place in kidnapping people that Charlie suspects to have money or things he wants, holding them and beating them for days. Looking at people in these pictures, some have been identified, but most are still very unknown. It's speculated that many people were killed in the cult that went against Charlie's orders and made problems. Charlie even says multiple times in interviews that there are so many bodies buried out there at Spawn Ranch, they'll never be found. This could be true, or just Charlie talking. It's said that Susan Atkins was the first one that would find Spawn Ranch around 1967. The property was once used as a filming location, where many big movies were made in the 40s and 50s, but now it was just run down, the owner not able to keep up with it. Charlie and his followers would move onto the property, moving right into the abandoned church that was built on the location. Charlie's big plan is starting to take shape. He's picked out his most reliable. Charlie tells them it's time to start Helter Skelter. The murders that would take place in August were just not simply thought of in one night. Charlie had been checking out the residence where Roman Polanski and his wife, Sharon Tate, were leasing. Charlie had been caught on the residence months prior and just simply said he was a maintenance man. Many different accounts would come out after the murders from the Manson family, but this is what we know to be true about these 2 nights in August of 1969. With these foul murders, Charlie would send out members the first night on August 8th to the Tate residence, but Charlie himself would stay behind. Tex Watson, one of Charlie's captains. They would have a meeting the day before. Charlie would explain to Tex what was going to happen. He explained the property to Tex, things about it, since Charlie had been there himself. Charlie told Tex, when he made his way into the property, to kill everyone inside and show no mercy. Be ruthless. Set an example. The famous four that would lead that night, on August 9th, are Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Linda Kasabian. They would hop in their 1959 Ford Galaxy and head to the hills of Hollywood, where 5 people are in a house right now, enjoying their life, completely unaware that there are a car of 4 people headed their way to brutally murder them. Tex and the 3 girls arrived that night. They parked their car down the hill and walked up the long driveway of the property. Tex will climb up a power pole, cut the telephone line. As he gets down, he sees a car coming. This is where they will run into their first victim of the night. Just a kid, the wrong place at the wrong time. A young kid, just 18 years old, named Steven, was leaving the home, trying to sell a radio to a friend at the home, but having no luck. After hanging out for just a short time, a little after 12 a.m. that night, Steven got in his car and started to leave. When just barely leaving the parking lot, he was stopped by Tex, wielding a knife and a gun, told Steven to stop. Steven could see the weapons. Tex was not hiding them. Steven was young and scared and knew this was a bad situation. All we know is that Steven pled for his life, asking to be let go. Tex then started slashing at Steven. Steven, putting up his hands in self-defense, was badly cut, his watch being cut off his wrist and flying in the back seat of the vehicle. He's screaming for his life. Tex then pulls out his .22, shooting Steven in the left cheek and twice in the chest. Steven will die in his father's car, right there in the parking lot. William Garretson was 19 years old, who was the caretaker for the property, living in the guest house. William had loud music playing and did not hear a sound, he said. Many to this day still believe that William had something to do with the murders in the Manson family, but after being investigated and passing polygraph, he is said to be innocent. The 4 made their way up to the house, Tex walking to the front, seeing a window open to where he would cut out the screen. He climbed through quietly, not being heard, standing up and unlocking the door. And this is where Susan, Linda, and Patricia walk in. Tex told the girls to round up everyone and bring them to the living room. Abigail Folger's boyfriend, Mr. Frokowski, would be sleeping on the couch, soon finding Tex standing above him, kicking him in the head. The girls then soon have everyone else in the living room. Tex would tie Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring by their necks, slinging the rope on one of the beams above them to where they were tied to each other and would choke the other one if they ran away. But Sebring says, "This needs to stop," yelling it at Tex. "Miss Tate is pregnant. This cannot happen." Tex, with no warning, shoots Sebring. He falls to the ground and dies. Now it's known by all in the house that they will die. Panic sets in. They all scream. They know this is just no robbing. Something else is going on here. Frokowski would free himself from being tied up by a towel. He would get into a struggle with Susan Atkins, trying to wrestle the knife out of her hands. He eventually threw her to the ground, running to the front of the door, where Tex would catch up with him, hitting him in the head with his gun, and then stabbing him. Frokowski soon runs into the yard, but hurt and losing blood. Tex will stab him 51 times to death. The only ones left alive now are Abigail and Tate, scared beyond their belief about what's happening, screaming for help. Abigail runs out of the house herself, to be caught by Krenwinkel. Krenwinkel stabbing Abigail to death. The only person alive at this point is Miss Tate. With a rope around her neck, lying on the floor next to the couch, she begs for her baby's life, saying she'll become a hostage just enough time to give birth to the baby. But Atkins and Tex stand over her and start stabbing her to death. The murders did not go as planned. It was fast, rushed, and in a panic. The only thing that went right is that all the victims were killed. Once the murders are done, Atkins writes "pig" on the front door, part of the movement for Helter Skelter. The house goes quiet. Everyone is gone. Their bodies are still warm. They will lay there the whole night until they are found the next morning by the housekeeper. Just a short time of terror that 5 people just endured, and a baby that was never born, are now dead. It's over just like that. The 4 are covered in blood as they make their way back to the vehicle. Their panic and startled themselves have just committed one of the most horrific murders in recorded history. When they're leaving the property, heading back down the long driveway, they start taking off their clothes, throwing them over the hillside. They're covered in blood. A news crew will find the clothes while they are trying to film the house. They find pants, Tex's shirt. It's obvious that these clothes belong to the murder. The gun that was used is also found in a yard by a little boy. The little boy will bring it to his parents. When the father takes the gun from his little boy, he can tell that it's covered in blood. When they arrive back home to the ranch, they will find Charlie and explain in detail what happened, giving him the $70 they took from Abigail Folger. But they're not greeted with well wishes. They're greeted with it could have been done better and cleaner. And Charlie will tell them they're going back out the next night, and he will accompany them to make sure they do it right. When Roman comes home, the only thing that's left in the house is the smell of death and blood. The house is left the same from the murder and what the police took and looked through. Once where he took such a beautiful photo, now another photo will be taken, to where he is confused, heartbroken. Susan Atkins using the blood of Tate that she soaked in a towel to write pig on the door. After the murders the next day, confusion and disbelief and fear going through the city of Hollywood. Nothing like this has ever happened. The news media is covering as much as they can. It's the biggest story in the United States and traveling through the world. But with everyone's confusion, what they don't know is that the same thing is about to happen again. Charlie will go back out himself. Charlie will bring the girls and Tex with him. A few different accounts would come out of how they broke into the house and how the murders actually took place, from different books and interviews that the family would write and say, this is what we believe to be true, is that when they arrive at the house at the Labiancas, they park the car. Charlie and Tex make their way up to the house, finding a back door unlocked. They make their way into the house. Charlie and Tex will both tie up Mr. and Mrs. Labianca. Soon the girls will enter. When everyone is inside, Charlie is trying to calm down and assure the Labiancas that everything is okay and they'll be just fine. It's not going to lift a finger to hurt them. This is true. Charlie then walks out telling Tex what he wants. He tells Tex to kill them, but make sure everyone has a part in this and gets their hands dirty. Charlie then goes back to the car, waiting. Once Charlie leaves the house, Tex takes over yet again. The Labiancas are sitting on the couch, scared out of their mind. They have pillowcases over their head, with their hands tied up. The girls carry Mrs. Labianca to her bedroom. Tex will start stabbing Mr. Labianca right there on the couch, in his neck. He's screaming in agonizing pain. His wife hears him. She starts screaming his name. When she gets in the bedroom, the girls throw her down. They tie a cord around her neck, but in that she will start fighting the girls. Tex hears the commotion, goes in, stabs Mrs. Labianca a few times, runs back to the living room and continues to stab Mr. Labianca. Once again, the murders are out of control and turn into a bloody mess of torture and screaming. When Tex comes back in, Mrs. Labianca is still alive, but Lisa will start stabbing Mrs. Labianca in the lower back to death. Tex will take his knife and carve the word war in the chest of Mr. Labianca. They start graffitiing the walls in the house, the refrigerator with Helter Skelter, the walls with pig, using the blood. They drink chocolate milk out of the fridge, eat watermelon, rummage through the house a little bit, cleaning themselves up, and then simply leave the home. After these murders, the next day, mass hysteria breaks out in Hollywood. Actors, musicians, anybody with a mansion and money flees the city, catching planes, driving off, or buying guns. No one is sticking around. The police are clueless with who committed the murders, and they are saying they're all drug related and have no answers for the public. But soon Manson and many of his family members are arrested. When the world first sees Charlie, he seems like a sweet little guy. He speaks quiet. He seems to have manners. He's small. He doesn't look evil, but that is part of the art of Charlie. He plays the innocent card, and while the rest of the family starts breaking, many stories come out of who did what. As details about the crime come out, Charles Manson is becoming one of the biggest celebrities in the world at that moment, and the world could not believe what they are hearing about the crimes. Charlie's spending more time incarcerated. He loses his shyness, his politeness, very fast. He becomes outspoken, talking about his race war, shaving his head, carving a swastika in his forehead. His followers will also shave their heads, carving X's in the middle of their foreheads as well. Charlie will spend the rest of his life in prison, along with the members of the Manson family that committed the murders. There's not too many of them left today. Most of them have already died in prison from natural causes. When it comes to Charlie, there's more interviews of Charlie talking about Charlie's thoughts than there are the world's most famous serial killers combined. Charlie speaks with many different interviewers over the years, messing with them, never giving them what they want, but just talking in circles. Charlie was set to die in the gas chambers years back, but due to California taking away the death penalty, he will live the rest of his life out in San Quentin prison. One thing to look at when you look at the people who committed these murders, besides Charlie, is that many of them came from good families. They were smart people, did well in school, had loving parents, but somewhere in the middle, became shipwrecked, looking for more in life, looking for their own tribe. Tex Watson himself was voted most to succeed in school. He was a star in football, baseball, but in the end, he became the one pushing the murders, making sure they actually happened. It takes years for the members that have been locked up and convicted to break away from the fear of Charlie and to understand what he had had them do. Many people, even after Charlie was convicted, still loved him and believed that he was a god. Many members of the cult will continue to live on Spawn Ranch and Baker Ranch into the early 70s, praising Charlie and pleading his innocence. Even though it's over 50 years ago, the crime, even today, is still horrific and unbelievable for what the victims had to go through. It was not a simple death. It was not a fast death. Fear does not even qualify for a word for what the victims went through. But friends, until next time, know that there are cults around us today still, so be careful who you listen to and look at as a savior.